What if humanity were not at the top of the evolutionary chain? What if behind religions, wars, economic crises and suffering, there was something more? Salvador Freixedo, a former Jesuit priest, dared to say it out loud. Human history has been manipulated by invisible entities that control us from the shadows.
The thing about people who are truly and malignantly crazy, their real genius is for making the people around them think they themselves are crazy. Some of the topics David Foster Wallace chose to write about can be kind of hard to take. He was the undisputed master of mapping the inner states of depressives, junkies, perverts, cat murderers, and a pantheon of hideous men. How does that old creative writing class adage go? Write what you know, right? Note 12. On that same subject, it's worth contemplating the words of DFW's close but competitive friend, Jonathan Franzen. Quote, David's fiction is populated with dissemblers and manipulators and emotional isolates, and yet the people who only had glancing or formal contact with him took his rather laborious hyper-considerateness and moral wisdom at face value. End quote. Franzen received a public scolding from irate DFW fans for not being in the unthinking St. Wallace camp with his 2011 essay in The New Yorker, Farther Away, Robinson Crusoe, David Foster Wallace, and the Island of Solitude. You could tell he was still kind of pissed at DFW when he wrote, quote, He was sick, yes, and in a sense the story of my friendship with him is simply that I loved a person who was mentally ill. The depressed person then killed himself in a way calculated to inflict maximum pain on those he loved most, and we who loved him were left feeling angry and betrayed. Betrayed not merely by the failure of our investment of love, but by the way in which his suicide took the person away from us and made him into a very public legend. People who had never read his fiction, or had never even heard of him, read his Kenyon College commencement address in the Wall Street Journal and mourned the loss of a great and gentle soul. A literary establishment that had never so much as shortlisted one of his books for a national prize, now united to declare him a lost national treasure. Of course, he was a national treasure, and being a writer, he didn't belong to his readers any less than to me. But if you happen to know that his actual character was more complex and dubious than he was getting credit for, and if you also knew that he was more lovable, funnier, sillier, needier, more poignantly at war with his demons, more lost, more childishly transparent in his lies and inconsistencies than the benignant and morally clairvoyant artist saint that had been made of him, it was still hard not to feel wounded by the part of him that had chosen the adulation of strangers over the love of the people closest to him. Yeah, okay, well, Franzen seems to be arguing here for a more polite way of committing suicide, although I don't know what that would have looked like. Maybe DFW could have gone the Hart Crane Spalding Gray route, jackknifing off the side of a big boat and getting himself declared lost at sea. A fatal drug binge could have provided the people closest to him with the comforting illusion that he'd mistakenly OD'd a la Sebastian Horsley. Certainly, the Kurt Cobain shotgun under the chin method would appear even ruder than a homely back patio hanging, so that one gets ruled out. What's left then? Suicide by cop? Defenestration? Dousing himself with Exxon Plus and sitting in full lotus as his white bandana and dirt bomb t-shirt went up in a shroud of flames? When you're surrounded by judgmental friends like Franzen, there's no way to exit this world without being accused of choosing the adulation of strangers over the intimacies of those who would tell every reader of The New Yorker that you spent your last moments calculating how to inflict maximum pain on those he loved most. So screw it. Like Dorothy Parker said, you might as well live. Note to the footnote. How competitive was Franzen? He wrote the corrections in response to Infinite Jest. Many people, and I'm one of them, consider the corrections to be the superior book. That's not a feat that any random jackass could pull off. You have to be a hyper-competitive jackass to surpass a friend like David Foster Wallace and make him look bad. For some, it's not enough to win the National Book Award and get your semi-handsome mug on the cover of Time magazine next to a Great American Novelist tagline. To be truly happy, you need to see your friends hang. Okay, I'll admit that's a cheap shot, and Franzen probably isn't deserving of it. But it's not like we're ever going to hang out, and there's almost zero chance he'll ever run across this essay, so I'm going to let it stand. Return to main text. What Wallace did for depression is similar to what Kafka did for existential futility and dread. Take the character Kate Gompert, who turns up early in Infinite Jest in a psych ward, where, quote, sarcasm and jokes were often the bottle in which clinical depressives sent out their most plangent screams for someone to care and help them, end quote. Rereading that book now, and knowing quite a bit more about DFW's personal life than I did during my first read-through in 1996, I can't help but think of Kate Gompert as coded autobiography, a suicidal girl on Parnate with a lithium kicker, who served as a sweaty little slice of gender-inverted Bildungsroman for Wallace, who suffered his first full-blown mental breakdown while still an undergrad at Amherst. Kate Gompert allowed him to articulate the bleak reasoning of an extremely smart young person suffering from clinical depression. Quote, there's no way Kate Gompert could ever begin to make someone else understand what clinical depression feels like, not even another person who is herself clinically depressed, because a person in such a state is incapable of empathy with any other living thing. If a person in physical pain has a hard time attending to anything except that pain, a clinically depressed person cannot even perceive any other person or thing as independent of the universal pain that is digesting her, cell by cell. Everything is part of the problem, and there is no solution. It is a level of psychic pain wholly incompatible with human life as we know it. It is a sense of radical and thoroughgoing evil, not just as a feature, but as the essence of conscious existence. End quote. Of course, Kate Gompert isn't the only depressed character in the DFW canon. In fact, there's a depressed narrator in Wallace's first published work of serious short fiction, The Planet Trilithon as it stands in relation to the bad thing, which begins, quote, I've been on antidepressants for, about a year now, and I suppose I feel as if I'm pretty qualified to tell what they're like, end quote. There's also the thinly veiled depiction of the self-obsessed writer Elizabeth Wurtzel, who wrote Prozac Nation and Bitch, in The Depressed Person. Quote, the depressed person was in terrible and unceasing emotional pain, and the impossibility of sharing or articulating this pain was itself a component of the pain and a contributing factor in its essential horror. End quote. There's the suicidal narrator at the center of Good Old Neon. Quote, self-loathing is not the same as being into pain or a lingering death. If I was going to do it, I wanted it instant. End quote. There's the suicide of James Owen Condenza by a microwave oven in Infinite Jest. There's the, I could go on, but that would just be depressing. If any one paragraph about depression stands out among David Foster Wallace's many, many paragraphs about depression, it might be the one that follows. It's attributed to Kate Gompert in Infinite Jest, but it sounds like something Wallace might have wanted to say to those he left behind after he hanged himself in Claremont, California at the age of 46 on September 12, 2008, the day when the singular thrill of being David Foster Wallace, celebrated author, cavalier coxman, and widely heralded genius, was no longer reason enough for him to go on living. Note 13. About that cavalier coxman crack, Wallace was a shameless pussyhound for most of his adult life. He said to Rolling Stone journalist David Lipsky as a prelude to hitting the road with him for the last leg of the Infinite Jest book tour, quote, most of the fame stuff doesn't matter to me, but I really did think maybe I could get laid on this tour, end quote. To be fair, I should point out that DFW's veiny red custard chucker didn't control his every foray into fornication. The tail stopped wagging the dog when he married the artist Karen Green on December 27, 2004. The people closest to Wallace believe he remained faithful to Green during the last 4 years of his life, and he was happy about it, even when he went off Nardole in his final year and became unhappy with just about everything else. Quote, having been quite feral, he was proud of his domestication, end quote, Green has stated. But let's qualify that. After 17 years of marriage, I can report that domesticity has its own horrors for those prone to depression. Putting marriage aside, along with its attendant monogamy and monotony, here's a fun fact. Wallace tried to bang Elizabeth Wurtzel while he was touring for Infinite Jest. If that's not a deliberate attempt to stick your dick into crazy, then I don't know what is. Here's how Daniel Max explains their dysfunctional courtship in Every Love Story is a Ghost Story. Quote, Elizabeth Wurtzel had continued during the past year to entrance Wallace, One time he had called Franzen from a payphone at 3 a.m. when they were out together to say, "I'm with a girl who has heroin in her possession. This is not good." Then, after the KGB reading, she brought him back to her apartment and took him up to her loft bed, but at the last minute changed her mind about sex. Wallace, suspicious that she had only brought him home in the first place because of his rising fame, grew furious. "You're gonna make me drink again!" he shouted at her. He threw on his clothes and stomped out, ending the friendship. Personally, I'm not inclined to judge Wallace too harshly for that dick-led lapse in judgment. Looking at photos in Google image search of Wurzel from her Prozac Nation days when she was still in her 20s, I had no doubt that had she graciously provided me with the opportunity, I would have wanted to bang her too. And if I'm going to continue to be candid, in terms of sheer craziness, Wurzel probably had nothing on my two flipped-out exes, Justine the Screaming Eelskin Queen and M.M. As Wallace admitted to Lipsky on their road trip, documented in the book, although of course you end up becoming yourself, which became a movie starring Jason Segel and Jesse Eisenberg called The End of the Tour. He had a preference for crazy women, and had, quote, ended up with lots of crazy ones, end quote. Psychotics, say what you want about them, Wallace joked. They tend to make the first move. He followed up that observation with another one about domestic companionship that struck me as so funny and true that, again, it probably reveals something unflattering about my own psyche. Quote, "It's just much easier having dogs. You don't get laid, but you also don't get the feeling you're hurting their feelings all the time." End quote. Return to main text. As I was saying, if any one paragraph about depression stands out among David Foster Wallace's many, many paragraphs about depression, it might be the one that follows. It's attributed to Kate Gompert in Infinite Jest, and it goes like this. Quote, "The so-called psychotically depressed person who tries to kill herself doesn't do so out of, quote, hopelessness or any abstract conviction that life's assets and debits do not square, and surely not because death seems suddenly appealing. The person in whom its invisible agony reaches a certain unendurable level will kill herself the same way a trapped person will eventually jump from the window of a burning high-rise. Make no mistake about people who leap from burning windows. Their terror of falling from a great height is still just as great as it would be for you or me, standing speculatively at the same window just checking out the view, i.e. the fear of falling remains a constant. The variable here is the other terror, the fire's flames. When the flames get close enough, falling to death becomes the slightly less terrible of two terrors. It's not desiring the fall, it's terror of the flames. And yet nobody down on the sidewalk looking up and yelling, 'Don't!' and 'Hang on!' can understand the jump. Not really. You'd have to have personally been trapped and felt flames to really understand a terror way beyond falling." End quote. All this writing about depression acts as a mind virus, a shared sickness. Reading it, you begin to feel somewhat depressed yourself. Well, at least I do. Could that be intended? I believe that argument could be made, and I'm just the guy to make it. My internet friend Jason Horsley has written an essay that seems relevant here. It's called Raskolnikov and the Peanut, Mirror Neurons and the Arcane Art of Writing. It starts out like this.
In 1992, or so the story goes, Giacomo Rizzolatti and a team of neuroscientists accidentally discovered mirror neurons while experimenting on monkeys. The monkeys had their brains wired up in order to observe how motor neurons related to hand movements, and when a monkey picked up a peanut, the neuron fired. But to the team's surprise, the same motor neuron also fired when the monkey was watching a lab assistant pick up a peanut. Apparently, to the monkey's brain, seeing someone grabbing a peanut was a similar experience to grabbing the peanut itself. Action and perception were tightly linked. I don't know how true this story is. It's probably an apocryphal way to catch the average person's attention, because the real story of how mirror neurons were discovered or posited is, like Stephen Merritt's Book of Love, long and boring. I also don't know how reliable or desirable knowledge gained by torturing monkeys is. But the idea of mirror neurons is now firmly established in scientific culture, and I'll be damned if I'm not going to use it.
Jason goes on to unpack his theory that if our reality is
a language-based construct,
a concept that is simple enough to understand, if not believe, now that
everybody knows, thanks to ubiquitous computer programming, that code creates images and images reflect and can pass for reality.
It follows, then, that the act of reading can heal or harm us, depending on how the language gets our mirror neurons to fire.
Language becomes script, code.
Writing introduces the possibility of thought transference occurring,
Not only across space, but across time.
because the science of mirror neurons argues that
The writer's mood and current circumstances, even when they are in no way inferred by the written or spoken material itself,
can be transmitted via language to the reader, who, in a kind of shared trance, matches brain states with the author. Who could be alive or dead? It really doesn't matter. What counts is
the brain state of the author at the time of writing.
Here's a more straightforward take on the same subject by Tika Luttrell, author of Mirror Neurons, We Are Wired to Connect. Neuroscientists have discovered specialized cells in the brain called mirror neurons that spontaneously create brain-to-brain links between people. This means that our brainwaves, chemistry, and feelings can literally mirror the brainwaves, chemistry, and feelings of those who we are communicating with, reading stories about, watching on television, or people who we simply have in our thoughts. This is perfectly natural and has been happening all along. It allows us to instantly empathize with others and to know what they are feeling and experiencing. Jason points out some rather interesting and disturbing implications for his writers and mirror neurons theory after drawing attention to a scientific study cited in Up from Dragons, The Evolution of Human Intelligence, in which
A group of people imagining physical exercises increased their strength by 22% as compared to a group performing actual exercises whose strength increased by 30%. No wonder Jane Fonda's workout video was such a success. If our muscles can improve simply by watching a fitness video or even by reading about someone working out, what about the countless acts of violence which we vicariously experience day after day in movies, novels, TV shows, comic books, and rap songs?
Blow a chick back like I blow through a trap.
It's no wonder the military is among the leading researchers in video game technology. If mirror neurons exist, then the soldier in training doesn't know the difference at a physiological level between simulated acts of war and the real thing.
We got a ton of contacts front back.
Let's go!
Okay, so by now I think you can see where I'm going with this. A clinically depressed writer like David Foster Wallace passes along his clinically depressed brain state to his readers. As DFW himself put it during his long talk with David Lipsky, quote, I think with writing it's really feeling that their brain voice for a while becomes your brain voice, and that you feel the Vulcan mind meld, perhaps, is a better analogy. End quote. When you tentatively read something that DFW wrote, your mind becomes entrained with his mind at the time of the writing. Which is why, when you read any random passage in which DFW deployed his immense talent and extraordinary powers of observation to depict one of life's many horrors, as in the short story Incarnations for Her Children, and really, I'd advise you to stay away from that one in particular, it should come with a trigger warning, you'll often wind up feeling like you need to puke. So I'll ask the question one more time. Could that be intended? We're talking about social engineering here. PSYOPs, trauma-based mind control. The thing about people who are truly and malignantly crazy, their real genius is for making the people around them think they themselves are crazy. Is that sinking in now? Do the popes of high culture reward certain writers with movie deals, MacArthur grants, and prominent spots on the new fiction tables at every Barnes & Noble, etc., because they excel at making us crazy? And if so, why? Why are they rewarded? Why do the popes of high culture want to make us crazy and miserable? Note 14. The popes of high culture is necessary shorthand for the vanishingly small number of media executives who make the major decisions about who will be deemed the important writers of our time, now and in the future. The international prestige lit racket, for instance, is currently controlled by a trade book publishing cartel that consists of HarperCollins, Macmillan, Penguin Random House, Simon & Schuster, and Hachette. Those companies, in turn, are either owned by or beholden to less than 20 global multimedia conglomerates that control 90% of the world's books, newspapers, magazines, radio and TV stations, movie studios, and web news content. They are Comcast, Disney, Time Warner, 21st Century Fox, News Corp, Viacom, Sony, CBS Corporation, iHeartMedia, Bertelsmann, Hearst, Vivendi, Televisa, Lagardère Group, Google, and Amazon. Did I miss anyone? As the late, great Paddy Chayefsky had Howard Beale describe the situation in the movie Network, those conglomerates function collectively as
The most awesome goddamn propaganda force in the whole godless world.
and they'll tell you
Any shit you want to hear.
accept the truth when it's inconvenient to their soft fascist hegemony. Return to main text. So, why do the popes of high culture want to make us crazy and miserable? I'll tell you why. See, there's this horny sea monster, and, there's a man-eating gin in the backseat of a beat-up Chevy, and it's not quite it either. There's a UFO-propelled horde of spindly gray aliens probing human sphincters with high-tech speculums and... crap. Let's start over. Hold on. There's a hostile, jealous god known to the Gnostics as the Demiurge, who created this calamitously fucked-up world and now rules it, maliciously, with the help of interdimensional mind parasites, known as Archons, who stoke our pain and mental anguish so they can energetically consume it. And... okay, now we're finally getting somewhere. Sci-fi stuff, right? Not to be believed. But consider the evidence. If you take a hard, objective look at what our species has been up to on this planet, you almost have to conclude that we're self-harming victims suffering from a massive collective psychosis. Here's how I summed up the current state of America in the early pages of my 2016 book, Crash Gordon and the Illuminati Underground. Everything's turned inside out, upside down, and backwards from the way things ought to be. The middle class is being taxed right out of existence so we can give subsidies to corporations that shield their profits from taxes offshore. Politicians whore themselves out to the highest bidders and get elected based on their willingness to legislate the will of the people right out of the legislative process. Big pharma and health insurance companies do everything they can to prevent us from getting the health care we need, while steering us instead into insanely expensive medical regimes that cause harmful side effects and do a poor job of curing our ills. Lawyers and judges pervert the rule of law to oppress the poor and let the rich get away with murder and mass thievery. Colleges deliberately promote obscure theories over real knowledge while saddling students with crippling debt, turning potential free thinkers into overtaxed wage slaves. Meanwhile, U.S. foreign policy seems intent on destabilizing the Middle East and starting a new Cold War with Russia. We terrorize other countries to supposedly stop terrorism, while the National Security Agency spies on its own citizens, making the whole world more insecure in the process. Note 15. The NSA isn't the only taxpayer-funded intelligence agency spying on U.S. citizens. The Vault 7 data dump from WikiLeaks revealed that the CIA has been even more aggressive than the NSA in its domestic spying operations, which doesn't bode well for our future, as a quote in Crash Gordon and the Illuminati Underground from former Assistant Secretary of Housing Catherine Austin Fitts makes clear.
When you look at what's happening with that, something very new is happening in the last 20 years that has never happened before. We have seen debt used as a control mechanism, and we've seen entrapment of nations and economic hits on nations using debt for centuries. So the game is old as the hills.
They are not numbers, they are lives.
But what I pointed out in Planet Debt is when you combine digital systems, payment systems, phone systems, smartphones, with artificial intelligence and relational database, and now you add the cloud, what you're talking about doing is being able to run economic hits at the individual level globally. Okay, so and this is why the Snowden revelations were so important, because if you look at them in combination with debt, we're talking about a much more invasive entrapment system.
This is what drove me forward. Eventually, I realized the U.S. government had stopped caring about what they should do, and instead were pursuing as aggressively as possible what they could do.
So literally, the system can reach through sovereign nations and start controlling everything from municipalities to households directly.
The technology for totalitarianism is already in place. It's only a matter of time before someone or something turns the key. Return to main text. Toward the end of that same book, I wrote, quote, "The problems of the world can seem overwhelming at times. Global warming, species extinction, poverty and drug trafficking, school shootings, mass murders, and false flag terrorist events used as fear-based justifications to curtail our civil liberties. Predatory financial institutions looting public funds and pensions, torpedoing our economy, and then demanding taxpayer-funded bailouts and austerity programs that erode social safety nets and inhibit infrastructure investment. The military-industrial intelligence complex waging multiple wars in a never-ending cycle that only increases the power and wealth of the deep state while screwing over everyone else. The new slavery ginned up by the for-profit prisons working in tandem with an increasingly militarized police force. The ravaging of our planet's ecosystem due to fracking, deforestation, overfishing, strip mining, and Monsanto's version of industrial agriculture. We're facing huge systemic problems demanding radical systemic changes. The present-day morally bankrupt neoliberal system of corporate capitalism and globalization is only making our situation worse because it operates like the archons. It consumes other people's lives for its own dark purposes. The pathology of greed is now eating away at everyone and everything. Things have only gotten worse since Donald Trump was elected president. The thing about people who are truly and malignantly crazy, well, you know the rest. Getting gaslit by our malignant narcissist-in-chief and the establishment media has become our national pastime. So you tell me, is there something fundamentally wrong with our way of life on this planet? Is there, perhaps, some underlying malevolence at work, deliberately screwing things up for us? Or did Professor Pangloss have it right? This is the best of all possible worlds. Really? That Panglossian gloss on reality doesn't work for everyone. If you're feeling unsure about it, check the headlines from my favorite news source, Cryptagon.com, for the week just passed as I write this, May 19th through the 25th of 2017.
Americans are paying $38 to collect $1 of student debt. U.S. Special Forces expanding shadow war in Africa. A quarter of American adults can't pay all their monthly bills. 44% have less than $400 in cash. CIA malware for all versions of Windows. Kim.com claims Seth Rich was WikiLeaks source. Manchester Arena suicide bomber kills 22. President Trump's budget includes $2 trillion math mistake. Baking soda shortage?
If that's not dystopian enough for you, this morning I read a story in the New York Times about a, quote, Palm Beach County man who ate so many cockroaches and worms in a bug-eating contest that he vomited, collapsed, and died, unquote. Note 16. The grand prize was an ivory ball python. If you live in Florida, I guess it's always worth gorging yourself on a shitload of bugs for the sake of a cool reptile. I could make a few jokes here about David Icke's reptilian fixation that would be understood by about 3 people, but I'll refrain.
He is the most Florida man in the world.
Return to main text. I also read that young women are trying to improve their, quote, wellness, unquote, by eating clay, sunbathing their vaginas, and paying $55 for a tiny jar of something called brain dust to sharpen up their obviously compromised mental faculties. David Foster Wallace, always the smartest guy in the room, despite his steady diet of blondies, Pop-Tarts, Diet Ricola, and mint-flavored chewing tobacco, wrote something in The Pale King that seems pertinent to the argument I'm setting up here for an essentially Gnostic way of looking at the world. Quote, maybe dullness is associated with psychic pain because something that's dull or opaque fails to provide enough stimulation to distract people from some other deeper type of pain that is always there, if only in an ambient, low-level way, in which most of us spend nearly all our time and energy trying to distract ourselves from. Admittedly, the whole thing's pretty confusing and hard to talk about abstractly, but surely something must lie behind not just music and dull or tedious places anymore, but now also actual TV in waiting rooms, supermarkets checkouts, airports gates, SUVs back seats, Walkman, iPods, Blackberries, cell phones that attach to your head. This terror of silence with nothing diverting to do. I can't think anyone really believes today's so-called information society is just about information. Everyone knows it's about something else, way down. End quote.